All right, everyone. I have 601. So we will go ahead and get started. My name is Adam Watson. I'm one of our agriculture agents here in Washington County, Tennessee. And so tonight we're going to be talking about homestead chickens. This is going to be introductory. If you've had chickens for a while, I'm not sure you're going to get a tremendous amount out of it, but I did want to offer this tonight. So just let me say that if I make use of any trade or brand names this evening or sources of animals or products, just understand that's just for communication purposes and understanding. It's not an endorsement by myself nor the university, nor is my failure to mention similar products or providers of services in any way meant to be negative. We simply do not endorse. So one big truth about keeping chickens yourself is that, quite honestly, we can very much easily purchase anything we might grow, probably at a cheaper price than we can produce it. Certainly, I'd encourage you to look to buy it from local farmers. But if your main reason for looking at keeping chickens is to reduce your food costs, you might find out it's disappointing in that area. But in truth, a lot of folks don't actually keep chickens solely for the economic benefits. There's all the other reasons that they do so. But this is kind of the disclaimer we do like to say up front. I will mention that a lot of tonight's material is actually from a presentation by Dr. Tom Tabler, one of our specialists at UT, so I appreciate his assistance in this. A big expense that's going to come, of course, is feed. Your chickens will need feed, and we'll talk about this in a little bit of detail to give you some idea of what you'd be looking for with your home flock. Certainly, the animals themselves, those birds, are going to have a cost. And then housing. Housing can be a wide range of pricing, depending how sophisticated you want it to be. And certainly, there are lower and higher end options. And the other thing to understand is if we're buying chicks and we're looking for eggs, which a lot of folks are looking at starting a home flock are, you're really looking at basically 6 months of effort and feeding before you start getting those eggs. And certainly you can purchase started pullets or even full-grown hens that are of laying age, but they come at a higher expense. So it's just offsetting that initial cost for that final cost of the bird itself. So just be aware of this. That being said, poultry is actually an excellent choice when starting livestock project, especially with youth. So for a lot of people that don't necessarily have the amount of acreage that other animals might require, livestock can begin with poultry, and so it's a great entry into things like 4-H projects. We have the Chick Chain project here in our county that kids can participate in. If you have more questions about that, I'd be happy to connect you with our 4-H folks. And so it is a great way to get children started in animal husbandry. And what's good about it is chickens are a smaller scale option for animals. So compared to a lot of other livestock choices, they actually are the cheaper place to start. And so because they are physically smaller animals, they are relatively inexpensive to buy and start with, certainly easy to acquire. We can easily, this time of year especially, find baby chicks locally. You can order those in. And so it's one of those things that if you've got a small plot of land, you don't have to have a farm to be able to successfully keep chickens. And so for a lot of people, this might be the only livestock answer for them, just given their current housing and living situation. I do want to mention a few regulations. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Tonight, I'm going to try to move quickly. I've got a lot of different slides. And tomorrow, I will send out an email to everyone that has a copy of the slides, as well as some resources I used in making this, so you can have that for your review. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just do understand if you are in the city limits of Johnson City, there are some requirements. There's a setback distance of 1,000 linear feet. So that sometimes runs into a problem, and certainly we have to keep animals in a manner that is safe for both the animals as well as the public as well. And so sometimes you will hear people say, well, Johnson City prohibits, the keeping of chickens. It's not entirely true. It probably could be read to prohibit roosters just because of noise complaints, but certainly well-kept chickens on the right lots in Johnson City are perfectly acceptable. Uh, Jonesboro has a little bit more specific and I think easier to read regulations. And so if you're under 2 acres at your home, you can have up to 12 hens and no roosters, but your coops themselves do have to be permitted as outbuildings. So there are some setback requirements associated with that. I'm not going to try to tell you what those are. I'm going to refer you to zoning on that. And then in the instance that you do have more than 2 acres, there are still some setback requirements, but there would be the possibility that you could have roosters if you're at more than 2 acres. So again, if you are in the city limits, there are some restrictions, but it's not an absolute prohibition for either Jonesboro or Johnson City. And certainly if you're in a different city nearby, make sure you're looking at their zoning regulations as well. Truthfully, zoning or not, I think we want to do some things that are common sense and be good neighbors. So if you have neighbors close to you, even if you're out in the county, you may want to consider not having roosters. If there's going to be a complaint about noise with chickens, it's probably going to be coming from roosters crowing early in the morning. So certainly you don't have to have roosters to have eggs. You just need the hens. So we can actually not have those and maybe prevent some difficulty with neighbors. Obviously, we're going to be cleaning our coops, how we're keeping them frequently enough so we don't have odors. We're also going to have a plan for what we do with what we clean out. Is it a compost pile that we're managing? Is it applied to our land somewhere, et cetera? And so there are some good ways and bad ways to do that. I'm not going to get in details tonight on that, but certainly if you have questions, you're more than welcome to follow up with me on that. Another thing that can sometimes happen with any sort of livestock keeping, sometimes we can create conditions that encourage rodents, mice or rats. Basically, we have feed. And if we have feed that is kept out and left out overnight and it's not secured well, that can be an attractant and certainly keep those rodents around. So we want to do a good job of keeping feed in metal containers, for instance, not overfeeding so that we don't have feed left out overnight. We only feed out what is needed during the day. And the other thing to consider, depending on where you're at, is not having free-ranging chickens. So certainly we'll talk tonight about some housing and how we can have enclosures in addition to a coop itself. And free-ranging chickens are fine, but if they're going onto other people's property or something like that, it's very easily becoming a problem. And so if we're wanting to be a good neighbor, we're probably not going to have any free-ranging chickens unless we have the land mass that allows us to do that. One thing I'm going to encourage you to do is have a plan in place before you get your birds. And so that is what I hope you get out tonight. It's going to kind of give you a 10,000-foot view of some things to plan for and some details you may not have thought of, because success with these animals does require some pre-planning. We want to make sure that you have things in place so that you are successful. Dr. Tabler mentions, 6 months in advance. I think oftentimes people that are considering getting chickens or any livestock really are very often thinking about doing it even longer than that. If you do have close neighbors, you might want to have a conversation with them and let them know what you're doing. Certainly if they see you building a coop or things like that, that's probably going to pique their interest. And again, lots of times just having those neighborly over the fence conversations can sometimes prevent ruffled feathers, so to speak. One of the big things about keeping livestock, and even small livestock like chickens, is the time it takes. And so, we're talking about daily chores with these birds. They're going to need water. They're going to need feed, obviously. And so it is something that you're going to have to do every day, regardless of the weather. So when it's a nasty, rainy day, you're still going to be out there doing some things. Another big thing to think about is how often are you away from your home? So if you like to take quick trips out of town, maybe over the weekend and things like that, Is there someone that can cover in your absence on those daily chores? So those are the sort of things we may need to really think hard about before we make that first purchase. And so we make sure we're not setting ourselves up to failure. Certainly, we do need to have housing for these animals. Weather is a big one. We'll talk briefly about climate broadly in chickens, but basically, as long as we have them well protected out of weather, they do well in our ambient conditions. So they're not a livestock that needs considerable climate control, so to speak, to be able to be successful here. Another thing is predators, and this may, if you live in a a neighborhood in a subdivision more than the country, you may not think this applies to you, but they are very much present in the city and suburb. Things like raccoons, for instance, can be terrible predators of chickens. And so, we know they're around even in urban areas. So certainly in our suburban areas, we can find them as well. So all of these need to be accounted for. And of course, one of the biggest things, if you've never kept any sort of livestock, if you've never had chickens before, do you know some basic husbandry? And of course, tonight, hopefully, we'll hit on most of those main points. The other thing is, if you have questions after you get them, feel free to reach out to our office. We'd be happy to talk with you. And, part of that planning is where you're going to be purchasing your feed. Certainly, there's plenty of options available to you. And I don't know that I could recommend one more than the next because we have a lot of good options in our area. Having a plan for that manure management. Do you have a plan if your birds get sick? Even if your birds never get sick and they eventually die of old age, you're still going to have something planned for their mortality. So certainly understanding what you might do in the event that you have a chicken die is a good plan to have in place. It allows you to be able to move forward when that happens efficiently and quickly and in a safe manner. So, these are some of the factors to think about in the back of our minds as we're planning ahead for these animals. Of course, a big decision for a lot of folks is what breed of chicken do I get? Honestly, it's up to you. There's not a right or wrong answer to this. Certainly, if you have a goal in mind, like egg production is your primary goal, there's going to be some that probably should be higher on your list than others. Same thing if you were wanting to raise a flock for meat production. There's going to be certain breeds that would be recommended higher than others simply because of the traits that are inherent to that breed. But truthfully, there are any number of options you can choose to achieve your goal. And sometimes it's availability or just what strikes your fancy. When we talk about chickens, we basically have two large categories. We have the standard or the large fowl or normal size birds, so to speak. That's the standard birds. Then we have bantams, and bantams are basically a miniature sized chicken, generally about a quarter of the size of the regular standard size. To a certain extent, they're ornamental birds, but they do absolutely produce egg production. Some of them have very good egg production. The thing to understand, of course, is because they're a smaller animal, those eggs are actually smaller as well. And so depending on what your ultimate goal to do with those eggs are, they may or may not be a great option for you. But because they're a physically smaller animal, they do take less room. So sometimes, especially when you have limited space, you can actually have more chickens if you go with the bantam simply because their size requirement is less than for our standard animals. One thing to mention, bantams generally are just miniature copies of a large breed, so we can find the same breeds as both standard as well as bantam. Silkies, however, would be the exception to that because silkies don't have that large counterpart. So silkies are one that a lot of people like to keep as chickens. They're certainly a little bit different looking and can be good egg producers as well as excellent mothers going broody. So they have a lot of interest in folks. And so those generally are still classified more or less as bantams because they're not the standard full size. Again, you're going to have more choices than you know what to do with. And so sometimes people have different reasons for raising chickens. And sometimes it's they want to find one of these old heritage breeds that maybe is not widely available. And so they want to do preservation. So in those scenarios, certainly you may be seeking out from smaller breeders rather than large hatcheries or things like that. Other folks want they're thinking about the dinner table. So not only eggs, but also meat. And certainly we have breeds that are dual purpose. They do well with both. We have some that excel at meat production, some that excel at egg production. And then some folks just want to have fun with it. And so there's nothing wrong with having different breeds in your flock. And certainly if you want to have roosters, you can work on breeding your own varieties of chicken. There was a gentleman who started a company ultimately for getting good feathers for tying flies for fishing. So fly fishing, and he basically has developed an entire business. That's what he did, as he selectively bred for feather qualities. And he basically has a very good business supplying feathers to the fly tying industry. So very interesting, but certainly different reasons, all valid. And we just have to make sure that the selection we make, the choices we make on breed support that. So this is just a few of commonly available breeds out there for us. And again, you will get this resource, so you don't have to worry about copying it down or anything like that. You'll get these slides. We do have those dual purpose breeds, and some of those are probably familiar to us. Things like Rhode Island Reds, Wyandotte, Orpingtons, and generally with any number of these, sometimes we have different colors associated with them too. So it's not just a single color option even. And so you can see there's some of the traits where we have egg production, egg size, egg color. A lot of people like brown eggs, but certainly there are white egg layers available to us as well. And also some comments about the disposition. And within any breed, any animal may be more gentle or calm than others, but certainly a lot of our commonly available breeds are easily approached and well handled. If we're talking about egg layers, here we have a little bit different list. And again, these aren't going to create the most meaty, best table fare in that regard, but certainly they are going to lay more and larger size eggs generally. And certainly we've got some of the more unusual ones like the Americanas that can lay the different colored eggs, sometimes called Easter eggers, which I know are not exactly the Americana breed, but where they're laying like the blue, the green, and the other tinted eggs. And certainly brown comes in a whole host of different shades. You have very light browns, very chocolatey, almost mahogany browns, depending on the species. So certainly you can mix it up in the flock and have quite a different palette of colors coming from the eggs. So if you didn't know that, that's part of the fun of it. So again, these are some options for egg producers. And if we were looking for meat birds, kind of the gold standard for meat birds are the Cornish crosses that are available from hatcheries, and certainly we have others as well. The modern broilers are very quick growers, so that's something that they turn around very quickly from chick to harvest. And these are going to be poor at other things. So if you're looking for something to do eggs as well, probably none of these would be high on your list, but certainly they do excel at being meat birds. So sometimes people do ask, is the climate we have here a consideration for which breed or variety I select? The truth is, in our area, we have all 4 seasons and we can have the extremes of all of them. So we have our hot, humid summers, we have our cold winters. So generally speaking, it's thought that Mediterranean breeds do better in hot, humid areas. And then most American breeds can do well in cool areas. The fact is we have both conditions. So it's not that any one group of chickens should be better for us, because if you get one that's excellent in cool weather, they still have our summers, and vice versa. If you get the Mediterranean breeds, we're still going to have our winters as well. What's good is basically any of the chickens with proper housing are going to be acceptable in our area. The one caveat to understand and know about is when we have severe cold, we can get frostbite on large combs, particularly on roosters, but even with some of the hens as well. So there are sometimes breeds that will have different combs associated with them. So they'll not only have the larger, but they'll have the smaller combs, such as row combs. And in those cases, it may be slightly beneficial to have those smaller comb varieties or selections within that breed, simply because it reduces the chance of frostbite. And again, if we have good housing, we can help limit the potential for this, but there are scenarios where we can get frostbite on combs. So speaking of housing, there are as many options as there are pictures on the internet. And so, the center top picture there, those are most likely broiler chickens. They're in a movable tractor. Never quite understood why they call them chicken tractors, because the chickens aren't pulling them. But oftentimes those movable pens are called tractors. You can see the number of different other options. The bottom right actually has a coop that is actually on wheels, if you notice. So we can have movable pens that maybe look a little different than the chicken tractors, although chicken tractors are very efficient for what we use them for. Typically, we think of those in more production type scenarios than home, but there's certainly nothing wrong with them, and they can be practical for use in the home flock as well. What we're looking for with housing is something that's going to protect the birds from weather, predators, injuries, maybe theft. And so we basically need a house that is dry and draft free. So we do need it enclosed, especially where we do have our cold winters. We do need to have it completely enclosed. Possible. Doesn't mean have to stay that way all year long, but having that ability to close it in during cold weather is important. We do want to pay attention to the wire we use when we build these, because it does need to be small enough to prevent predators from crawling through, and very small gaps can be exploited. So just because we have a small gap, a lot of our predators will work at it until it becomes a larger gap. So certainly making sure that we build these securely is important. There are kits, but if you're handy, you can certainly build one from scratch. There's any number of plans available online. And there are some things to think about on where we site these, particularly if it's one that doesn't move. So we do want well draining ground, because if we have this roof on there and it's shedding water, we don't want to be creating boggy or wet conditions that aren't going to drain well. So we prefer higher ground that does drain well. If we have an area that stays wet after it rains, we really don't want to be siting our animals there. They're not going to do well in wet conditions. The other thing to think about is how close to your house. Sometimes people will have, some land out in the country, and they're thinking about maybe putting the animals out there. The closer it is to your home, the easier it is for you to check on them frequently and do all the tasks that are associated with it. So we would encourage you to try to have that at your house rather than at a different property. You want to consider whether you want electricity or plumbing available to the housing. Neither is a requirement, but both can be useful. And so certainly that's a consideration. If you don't have it available, what might you do instead? And so just think about whether or not that's going to be what you want or need on your site, and that may help influence where you place it. And then certainly whatever we construct or purchase has to be able to be cleaned out without too much trouble. We have to clean these out for the health of the animals. And so the easier it is to clean, the more you're going to be patting yourself on the back in the future. So do consider how you're going to clean out their housing. Again, I said it before, there are the movable tractors. What's great about this is basically we are moving them to new areas as frequently as they need, sometimes daily, depending on the situation. And so it allows them to have basically fresh access to pasture, so to speak. When we have a fixed house, most of the time we will have runs associated with that fixed house that still gets them outside of that physical structure. Certainly, we can have animals confined indoors. We know a lot of commercial production happens in that scenario, but the truth is, when the birds have access to outside, they're able to engage in more normal behaviors, and certainly they probably have a happier life. Having the ability for them to access the outdoors, but still be protected inside a run is important to consider. We can have more than one run associated with a coop. So you could have a run on either end and you could rotate those back and forth. If you've ever kept chickens before, you know they can absolutely do a number on like a grassy area that you're using for a run. Depending on the number of chickens and how long they're there, they can remove all of that plant growing matter there in sometimes not too long of order. So having the ability to switch back and forth can help prolong some of that grass, for instance, that you have growing there. So here's just a few more. The scale just depends on what you're looking for and how many animals you have. You can see they're kind of in the center, a very small approach to it, but perfect for that trio of hens there. And certainly we have larger options. You'll notice in some of the pictures, particularly in the top right and the bottom right, electric fence netting. That is used a lot with the sort of farmers market size commercial producers. It is more about keeping things out than it is keeping the chickens themselves in. Certainly, there are considerations for cutting the flight feathers if we don't want chickens to fly away. And certainly they could easily fly over those fences if we didn't have their flight feathers cut on their wings. But if that basically is predator protection. And so it's to keep anything out. We're still going to be locking those animals up at night. It's not going to be secure enough that we could do that, but certainly during the day, we may have some excellent control with that. Fencing like this doesn't take care of our flying predators, though. So hawks, for instance, would not be impeded by that fencing at all. And so that's a consideration too. And certainly hawks are protected species, so we can't control them any other way. And so generally speaking, having a covered run is an excellent way to protect your flock from those flying predators. If you are thinking about building any sort of chicken housing, I'd encourage you to look online. There are available from different universities, various plans. A lot of those are probably larger than most of our backyard folks are going to need, but they can still give you some good ideas about ventilation and things like that. And certainly there's a host of plans available elsewhere online. The thing to consider is how large does it need to be? And so again, as I mentioned earlier, those bantam chickens, where they're smaller, they can certainly have a smaller house that's completely adequate, and whereas the same number of large birds wouldn't be happy at all. So these are some suggested minimum space requirements. You can see bantams are about 1 square foot of indoor housing, and then outdoor runs, we would love to have 4 square feet per bird, and you can see it going up. And you can see that different species of fowl require different spacing. And so certainly it's not uncommon for people perhaps to keep more than one type of fowl or poultry. And so do consider that maybe one size doesn't fit all. So you may be looking at different housing options for different species that you are keeping. And so just think about that as you are looking at constructing housing. What worked before might not necessarily work in the future. And one of the reasons we want to be particular about space we're providing these chickens is that when we have them in too crowded of conditions, we can oftentimes get a lot of picking behavior or cannibalism even happening. And so it is something we do want to pay attention to. When we crowd birds, it does not turn out well. It's probably worth noting, and Dr. Tabler put this in here, raising chickens is not as easy as you may have been led to believe. And the truth is it does take a lot of work. But it can be very rewarding. So I wouldn't ever try to dissuade someone from keeping their own flock, but certainly I would want them to assess and understand what it's going to require of them to do so. So where are we getting our chicks? there are any number of mail order hatcheries that we can order from. We can get them locally from local farm stores. You can buy from, other poultry keepers locally. There's always a chance, are we concerned about, diseases? The good thing with commercial options is they're coming from inspected hatcheries. Certainly, that's not an absolute guarantee that there couldn't be an issue, but where they are commercial operations are actually permitted and such, it does help give us a greater confidence that we should be getting quality animals. When we get them from the hatcheries, it is by mail order typically. So as funny as it might seem, you can send baby chicks through the mail. Of course, this works because the egg yolk is not completely gone for the first couple of 3 days. So there is the ability to ship those newly hatched chicks from the hatchery to the purchaser and have them arrive well and in good shape. There are always the horror stories you hear about shipments being delayed. It can happen. It does happen. Hatcheries are aware of that, and when they do, they will replace chickens that don't make it. And so, truthfully, these young chicks are, well, they're just small little animals, and so it is something where they do have to be protected and cared for. But this is actually very effective because of their ability to survive on that egg yolk even after they have hatched. If we look at our small flocks, we sort of have 3 periods where we kind of treat them a little bit differently as they're growing. And so we have the brooding period, which basically is the first 14 or so days we have them. After that, we have the growing period, which is where they're not ready for either harvest or sexual maturity yet. And so that's that period. And then we have egg production and breeding. That's when they are actually sexually mature. So brooding is that first 14 days following our receipt, or when we are having them hatch out of an incubator. Their survival basically depends on how they adjust to their new surroundings and how good a job we do at meeting their needs. This is a time of rapid development, and basically it doesn't really matter what your end purpose for that chicken happens to be. Brooding is basically always the same. So even if we have broilers or we have layers or we have just chickens for pets, the same needs and requirement are the same. And so there are these principles or basics of brooding that we can talk about. We're not going to talk about them necessarily by number, but we'll talk about them in general. But you can see things like feed, light, air, water, and sanitation are basically our focuses during the brooding period. And we'll talk about this. And temperature management is very important as well. Temperature is important because the baby chick in the beginning is not able to regulate its body temperature. So they look fluffy and great, but they can't keep themselves warm. And so that's why if you've ever had a hen actually hatch out eggs herself, first several days, you barely see the chicks. You'll just occasionally see them peeking out from under a bomb because their underbomb's staying warm. And so what this means is when we have these in our brooders, which is basically just where we're keeping them when they're young, we have to be able to control that temperature well and keep it warm enough for them. So that first week, we're looking for 92 to 95 degrees. And each subsequent week after that, we'll be dropping the temperature about 5 degrees. And so after about a month, depending on outside temperatures, they may be able to go out. If we've gotten chicks early and we're still having very cool conditions outside, we may keep them indoors even longer than that. So a lot of this does depend on weather conditions that are happening. Thermometers are good to use. So we'd like to be able to measure air temperature about 2 inches above the litter at the edge of the heat source. But in truth, no matter what a thermometer is telling us, we're going to watch the chicks because they're actually going to tell us a lot about the temperature. And so what I mean by that is depicted here are a few scenarios that can happen. If every chick is tightly clustered under our heat lamp, for instance, It's probably telling us they're too cool because they're really seeking out that heat source. So in that case, we need warmer conditions. So we might lower the light. We might add a second heat lamp, for instance. But it is a scenario where if they're tightly clustered, they're too cool. When we kind of have them spread out, some of them are closer to the heat source, some of them further away. That's when we have temperatures just right. If we see them at the extremes of their enclosure, that's basically telling us they're too hot. They're trying to escape that heat source. And again, because they're small, because they're little, if we're too hot or too cold, either one, we can create problems quickly. So we do want to pay attention to this and adjust as we go through. One thing to be aware of, depending where we have our chicks camp at, if it's in a garage or even, out in a barn or a shed, something like that, perfectly fine. But just understand that as we have just the natural drop in temperature at night, the heating method that worked during the day may not be sufficient. So you do want to check and make sure that if you do have them somewhere where there is a night and day fluctuation in temperature, that your heating method is still doing its job as temperatures cool at night. And then the last graphic there shows us a drafty situation. Again, they're kind of clustered away oddly, and basically they're trying to escape a draft. And so depending what we're actually brooding in physically, they do sell, brooding guards that are just basically, 24 inches high, maybe cardboard or plastic. They're basically rings that will just confine chicks to an area. Those can work. People will use stock tanks or homemade wooden boxes. There's any number of things we can use. We can even use things like cardboard boxes. But there are some things we need to take in consideration. The biggest thing we have to do is not have too much space. If you've got very few chicks, it's not going to take a tremendous amount of room to give them what they need. And quite honestly, because they are so small, if they have a hard time finding food, water, or heat, they can actually die. But at the same time, we can't keep them too crowded. So there is a happy medium there. Bedding for our brooder. It's often thought it's better to avoid small particles as our bedding, such as sawdust, simply because chicks might mistakenly be eating that rather than their actual feed. And that can be a real problem. And so it's not uncommon to recommend avoiding fine material and using something else. We do want to be careful about having slick surfaces in a brooder. Slick surfaces, which would include newspaper, basically they create poor footing conditions, and that will cause injuries. And so we can actually injure chicks if we have them on smooth surfaces such as newspaper. That doesn't mean we can't use newspaper underneath other materials. And certainly that can be a quick, easy way to where we can just roll up newspaper whenever we need to change bedding. But we don't want newspaper to be the surface that they're literally on. So believe it or not, paper towels actually have enough texture to them that they can be a good surface for chicks to be on. So certainly we can have paper towels over newspaper, and that can actually work well and again be quick and easy to change. One thing to note about these chicks, we do like to provide light continuously, at least for the first 24 hours or so. And part of it is just so they can get used to where to find water and feed. And we do want to make that easy for them. We do have to talk about safety, though, with brooding, because generally we are using a heat source, oftentimes a heat lamp or even just an incandescent light bulb. Those can start fires. So many chickens have been brooded in cardboard boxes or wooden boxes. Anything that is flammable is a danger when we're brooding. And so this is actually not an internet picture. Well, I stole it from the internet. This is actually someone I knew. They had a situation where they had their chicks on an enclosed porch, essentially. And while they were at work, the dogs managed to get in there and they bumped into the chickens and ultimately caused the heat lamp to come in contact with the brooder itself. And it came close to burning down their house. If it hadn't been for security cameras that caught the sound and then alerted the folks while they were at work, and then coincidentally enough, an off-duty police officer going home was on that road when dispatch called out, they probably wouldn't have had a house. So this is something to take serious. When we do have something that can be an ignition source, we really got to do a good job and safeguard how we do it. So make sure you are careful with this. There are some alternatives to heat lamps. So brooding heat plates, and you see a picture of one depicted there. They're all fairly similar. They come in different sizes depending on what the size or number of chicks that you have. They do need to be in close proximity to the chicks. So you see it very low there with these probably day old or nearly day old chicks. And that's perfectly acceptable because they are going to be getting underneath it for warmth. So that's why those legs, if you note closely, are screws essentially. So you can raise it as the chicks grow because they do need to be able to get in close proximity underneath it. These sometimes have a lower effective range, meaning that you can have conditions that are too cool for these to be entirely effective. So again, depending the time of year exactly you're doing this and what's happening with weather, you want to watch these carefully if this is your only heat source. And so just be aware that the manufacturer should have in their materials the operating range that these would be effective at to reach that higher temperature. And certainly if it's going to have weather outside of that range, you may consider either another heat source or possibly moving the chicks themselves for a period of time. Feed and water, obviously very important. And one of the biggest things we need to do is get the chickens used to going after feed and water. So having shallow feed trays in the beginning that are wide open and easily accessible is good. Because it encourages the chicks to eat. You can physically put them on the feed so they can't help but find it. And we can make feed trays for that purpose. So it doesn't have to be something we buy. We can utilize something, cut out the bottom of a milk jug. We can even place feed directly on something like a piece of paper or newspaper. We don't keep feed presented in this manner for long, just a few days, so they understand, hey, this is feed and we can find it if we look for it, because it does promote wasting of feed. You will find that they are defecating in these feeders and turning them over and scratching them out, all of which are good habits for them to learn, but certainly we don't keep them with feed presented in this way for a long period because of the waste that's associated with it. We can certainly purchase feeders. That picture there is actually from one of our chick chain. I think a couple of years ago, we weren't actually keeping chicks in that tight of quarters. These had just come in and they were going out, within hours, but we wanted to make sure that they had feed and water available to them. And so we just popped open the box, and actually I think these have been delayed for about a day. They were in good shape, luckily, but we wanted feed and water quickly to them. So if you think, boy, they're crowded, they got spaced out more than that, but that was just one of the pictures I happened to have. So just to give you an idea. Certainly, we can purchase feeders, and as they get larger, the covered feeders work well. You see the screw-on one there in the top right that works well because you can have a little bit of quantity of feed in there, and it's kind of self-filling. And again, as they grow, we're going to want to have more available to them. Waterers, there are any number of waterers we can use. Very often the first things we start with are just the simple screw-on waterers like you see up top. The red one you might notice looks a little different, and that is actually because it is a quail-sized waterer. Now the reason I included that picture specifically, if you have bantam chicks especially, and even some little pheasants and things like that, the normal-sized chicken waterer can be a real danger to them. They can fall in the water, they can drown in the water. Chicks are not necessarily the brightest bulb in the chandelier. So because of that, sometimes if you can source those quail-sized waters, particularly for bantams, that's a good thing. If you don't have that available to you, you can actually do things like put marbles in that waterer tray, so it lowers the depth and the ability for them to basically fall in and get wet. And so we can protect the chicks that way. Certainly, there are nipple or cup waterers available. Um, for a lot of people with just a few chickens that they're brooding, I don't know that that actually makes a lot of sense in the brooder. You may train them on that later when they're out in the regular housing, but certainly on a small scale, that might be a little more challenging to put a large waterer in a small brooder. We do want to make sure that we have feed and water readily available. This depiction is going to be a larger scale than probably what a lot of us would do for our backyard, but you may have more than one water and you may have more than one feed tray or feeder in there to accomplish having enough availability for those birds. Because essentially with these chicks, especially the younger they are, you want them to be able to quickly and easily find what they're looking for. And so if they're really having to search for it, it's not going to have the best outcome. So having some redundancy in there is not a bad thing. Sometimes I get questions from folks that are looking at doing something other than purchase feed. Quite honestly, I don't think you're going to find many benefits to trying to create your own feed. So we do have, excuse me, different grades or types of feed available to us. We have starter, we have grower, we have layer, and generally that's how they're sort of marketed, no matter what company we're buying from. The starter is generally more finely ground. It's a higher level of protein, and it is for those growing chicks that are rapidly growing. Grower is kind of the medium. This is on protein. This is where we still have quite a bit of growth and development happening, but not quite as much when they're at the very youngest stage. And then we have layer, and layer actually has extra calcium with a nod towards egg production. We don't actually want to use layer feeds for younger birds because we can actually have too much calcium in there for them. So we do want to be cautious about when we introduce layer and actually wait till we are basically at laying before we start using it. But we do have different feeds for different purposes. So do consider that. So if you've got just a few chicks, it may make sense for you to be buying starter by the pound rather than buying a 40-pound bag of it that you're not going to be able to use fully. When we talk about water, basically it's going to be water that you want to drink. So make sure it's clean and safe. We want the best for our animals, so it should be water that you wouldn't care to drink yourself. And again, especially when they're younger, if we have a larger brooder, we want to make sure that we do have feed and water close to that heat source. So if they're staying close to it, they're still able to get the water and feed that they need. And certainly some of you may have read or even done this yourself. You know, when you have new chicks and you're putting them into that brooder, introducing them to the water, actually dipping their beaks into the water is not a bad thing. Again, the bird brain is not ever meant as a compliment. So sometimes making sure they understand what is happening will really help improve their survival. A few other thoughts on feed and water, and I guess primarily on feed. Treats should be rare and just on the occasion. So formulated feeds are formulated purposely to meet the needs of the chickens. And if we are feeding a lot of treats to our animals, we can get some things out of whack if we're doing it frequently. So just be aware that treats can absolutely be used, but they should be thought of as treats, not as their primary food source. And even if we have our chickens free ranging, we still have to feed them. Free ranging chickens are going to have a difficult time finding everything they need, in part just because of the environments we live in. And so we do want to make sure that we still have feed available to our free ranging chickens. You very well may notice that they don't eat as much if you have them free ranging during summer, for instance. So certainly they're getting some of what they need on their own. But if you aren't feeding them, you're going to notice lower egg production, lower gains. If you're looking at meat birds, you have to supplement them. They still have to have their primary food source coming from you. And again, you know, if you are an animal nutritionist, you can disregard this, but if you're not, I don't think it's cost effective to try to formulate your own feed. And I think it's going to be difficult to get something that is actually nutritionally complete for your animals. Um, and so certainly if you've got the infrastructure, the physical abilities and machinery to do feed formulating, you could try that. But for most backyard flocks, it's going to be cheaper and easier to be purchasing a feed. Another thing to mention is grit. So grit is basically small little rocks. And so typically it's ground granite. And what that does is it's actually a physical grinding agent that they use in their gizzard to help grind up their food. You may have noticed chickens don't have teeth like you and I. So how does their food get ground up so it can be readily digested? It's in the gizzard. And so after about 2 weeks old, we want to look at making that grit available to those chickens. Yes, most of our commercial feeds are probably well enough ground that that's not critical, but still it's not a negative thing. You don't have to worry about chickens eating too much grit. If they're very free ranging, they may not eat much at all because they may be finding their own as they're doing what chickens do. But providing grit is a way to ensure that insufficient grinding of their food is not a problem. So making that grit available is good. We can also do oyster shells as a calcium supplement as well, but they themselves are too soft to be truly grit in the gizzard. So we don't substitute oyster shells for grit, but we can use it as a supplemental calcium source if we wanted to. Another thing to think about when it comes to feed and water, what happens in winter? So we obviously know at some point during our winters, we're going to have frozen waterers outside. When we have those cold snaps, and we always think it's, it's terrible. It's worse on our animals and it's worse on our farmers who are out there having to solve how am I getting water to our animals. So the good thing is if you've got electricity available to you in that coop, you can buy actually heated waterers that will maintain that water in an unfrozen state. And so certainly that's an option available to you, great. But oftentimes that's not the scenario we have. And so one thing I have seen folks do to deal with frozen waterers and freezing temperatures is actually basically have two sets of waterers. And so they'll put one out in the morning when they feed, and then before the chickens go to roost at night, probably a couple hours before, they'll go out and they'll swap it out for one that's not frozen. And then the one that is frozen gets to thaw overnight. And then the next morning it'll go back out and the one frozen will come back in. And so you're making sure that you have water available to that flock part of the time. They'll learn that, hey, when water is there, they will drink. So when you don't have the ability to keep it liquid through a heated waterer, you can look at doing that replacement. So it's available to them more than once a day, and that will maintain availability for them. Few details on the feed and water during that first week. Basically, you want to keep those feeders full. You want the chicks to find it and have as much available as they want. During the second week, you sort of start backing that off a little bit, maybe only feeding them 3/4 fulls. And then after the second week, we can even reduce it a little bit further because, again, they should be better at actually getting what they need, wasting less. And so it means we can have less feed present and still meet their needs. One of the big things is as they're growing, you do have to consider, do I need to put more feeders in there? Because you do want to have plenty of feeding space available to them. Ideally, there's enough linear inches on your feeders that all the birds could feed at the same time and have a little bit of space left over. So you do want to consider how many feeders you have. And again, we can purchase those. There's even plans online for feeders you can make that would be completely serviceable and good as well. Lighting is something to consider. Again, for commercial operations, it's something they take very seriously. Very often with home flocks, folks just don't really worry about it too much. But part of light is having to do with molting. So basically, hens will lay for a while. and then they will begin to go through a molt, which is how they renew their feathers. And a lot of it has to do with day length. So increasing your uh, day length or your period of light is how we can delay that molting from happening. Certainly there are folks that think it's better to be more natural and just allow the natural process to happen. There are some birds that are faster and quicker about molting. Others take longer. When a hen is molting, they won't be laying. So just be aware of that. So you can go through a period where you have healthy animals, but they are not laying. And so adding supplemental light can prevent that from happening. It does take a hen basically 25 to 26 hours to lay an egg, so slightly more than a day to actually complete that cycle and lay that egg. And so as long as we're maintaining 16 hours of light, so depending on how many hours of daylight we're getting, additionally adding to that up to get to the 16, we can actually have maximum production. We don't need a tremendous amount of light to do this. A low wattage bulb is sufficient, and we can put it on a timer to where obviously we don't have to remember to do it if we are wanting to do this. Light intensity can also have some effects related to picking or aggressive and cannibalism. So it is something that we want to consider if maybe we're having some of those negative behaviors. We may want to consider if supplemental lighting would help. So litter, we have any number of litter options that we might use. At the end of the day, it's for absorbing the moisture from the fecal matter. It is about providing cushioning for those animals and even insulating as well. So pine shavings is something that's very often used in the home flock. And it works well. Straw does not typically work great because straw does not absorb moisture well. So straw is not normally high on our list of suggested litter options. Rice hulls are not something we probably have available easily in our area, but that's something that can even be used. So that's something that can work well. So generally pine shavings is what we see a lot in our area. Another thing that I want to bring to your attention is builder's sand. So builder's sand is not play sand. Play sand is crushed silica. It's more uniform in color and shape. Building sand is the sand that has like all the little rocks in it. Sometimes it's called contractor sand, and it may have other names as well, but it is not the bagged play sand. And it's actually getting more attention as a bedding material. Even in commercial operations, they're looking at it more as a bedding material. And what research is showing is that there's not a downside to it. It performs just as well, if perhaps not better than some of their existing bedding materials they use. So builder sand would be a good option. You have, several inches of it in the house or even in the run. What's good about it, I think in the home scenario, is it can actually be cleaned periodically with kitty litter scoops. Basically, you're just sifting out the fecal matter and you're allowing the sand itself to actually remain. One good thing about it is it's obviously very well draining, which we would like to see. It dries quickly, giving that. And it also promotes natural behaviors such as dust bathing. So if you've never seen chicks dust bathing, it's fun to watch them, something they enjoy doing. If you do have free range chickens and you have areas that stay dry, like under a deck or something like that, it's not uncommon at all to find chickens in there actually bathing in the dust. So dust baths are something that they take, and so sand actually helps promote that, and they enjoy it. So yeah, I think sand actually may have several advantages to some of the other bedding materials, even the pine shavings in the home scenario. Good thing about it is it lasts a long time, and so that's something where typically if we were using pine shavings, every time we're cleaning, we're probably removing most, if not all, of those pine shavings. And when we do that, we have to replace it with builder's sand, where we're able to sift it. We're able to prolong its life, certainly in the housing, and so that probably lowers our cost. So again, we had talked about this earlier, but just understand that when we're in the growing stage, this is basically at the end of the brooding period and until those birds are sexually mature or in the case of broilers, harvested. The good thing during this period is the birds are basically better able to take care of themselves. So they don't have the same exact needs we saw with the brooding stage. Supplemental heat is still needed until they're fully feathered. And again, depending on ambient outdoor conditions, that can be longer or shorter. But typically, until they're at least 4 weeks old, not 4 years, 4 weeks old, we're going to keep them confined indoors where we do have the ability to easily maintain a good temperature. If we're going to have losses, chances are we had those losses earlier. And part of it is the birds have now learned how to find that feed and water. And so at this point, typically we see fewer losses, fewer mortalities than we did in the brooding stage. How long does it take for a hen to start laying? It really depends on the breed. But basically, for most, we're looking at 18 to 22 weeks of age. Smaller, lighter breeds typically tend to mature a little bit faster than the heavier breeds. But even within a breed, different animals can be arranged. So it's not like absolute clockwork that we'll always see laying happening. So just be aware it's going to take a while if you're starting with a day-old chick before you see those first eggs. This is sometimes why folks will buy chicks in the fall of the year, for instance, so that by the time spring rolls around, you're much closer to having eggs. And so that allows you to feed them over winter, grow them, allow them to mature, and then have them laying eggs earlier in the season than if we started with spring chicks. After we get through that growing period, once they have now reached sexual maturity, we're basically going to provide feed and water at all times. I would offer a caveat on the feed because we do want to be careful about attracting rodents, but certainly they're going to be being fed daily. Some people will actually feed twice a day. That way there isn't feed sitting there and possibly attractive to rodents, particularly if you know you've had a problem in the past. I know I had rats one year that found my bird feeders, and they enjoyed cleaning up on the ground below the bird feeders. If you know you have a situation where you might already have rodents present on your property, then or a neighbor's property, as the case may be, I would encourage you to really look at limiting when you have feed available. We want to make sure we have plenty for our chickens, but we don't want to be feeding anybody else. Water is actually very important for egg production, so we want to make sure we have plenty of water available. So that may mean multiple waterers if we have a large number of animals or a large coop or run associated with them. So we want to make sure that we have plenty of water available. If they're restricted on water, they're not going to be laying well. So make sure we do a good job with water. And we also want to make sure that their primary feeds do contain adequate calcium and phosphorus. And certainly this is where those formulated purchase feeds, I think, shine because they are purposely formulated to do so. We can also allow access to oyster shells for more calcium. It's not going to be a problem at all, but just keep in mind those are not a substitute for grit. And I might take a moment to mention, I know a few years ago online, there was quite a bit about certain feed sources, about, their a store, whatever they were producing for their feed, it wasn't good feed. It was purposely so the chickens wouldn't lay eggs. You may be surprised at this, but animal feed is probably more tightly regulated than human food. They actually go through more layers of regulation. They actually get sampled out in the field where there will be samples taken. They'll be tested to confirm that what the bag says is available is actually present. So there's actually quite a bit of regulatory hoops associated with animal feed. I say that to say that I think we can have confidence in any purchase feed from any source. Certainly there could be a snafu, things could go wrong. But I do not believe that there is a systemic problem with the feed supply system in this country. I think exactly the opposite. I think we have a very robust, safe, and adequate feed supply. And so if you're not familiar with all the regulatory hoops, they do exist for animal feed. And in my opinion, there's actually more with them with animal feed regulation than there is with human food sometimes. So that's just my soapbox for a moment. So if we are going to have that egg production, we do want to think about nest boxes in our housing. And so there's any number of ways that we can do this. For the average size hens, about a foot cubic, so 12 by 12 by 12 works well. You can be inventive and imaginative with this. Certainly the bottom picture is kind of the more traditional, but we can do some things such as repurposing buckets as we see in the upper picture. You'll notice they left the lid on the bottom portion because we don't want to have the ability for those eggs to fall out. So we do want to be careful. If we do construct, either we create a lip there or we have some sort of obstruction that's going to make sure those eggs won't fall out and break on us. And we do want to provide enough of these. So one box for every 4 to 6 hens is good. If you think you have a broody hen, and that's just to say a hen that's sitting on eggs, or if you want that to happen, you may actually provide more so that she's not being disturbed by other hens seeking a place to lay. And one thing to mention is it's not a bad thing if this is in a shady area or a darker area of the coop, because that can actually encourage the hens to sit there and lay, because that kind of makes them feel more secure. There are some negative things we can see happen with our hens. So sometimes we will have egg eating. And so basically it's thought often that this happens when we had an egg break. And so that's why we do like to have some sort of material in those nest boxes to help cushion the eggs and hopefully prevent any breakage. Because basically once we have chickens breaking eggs and eating them, that they sort of want to keep doing it. And so it can be a difficult habit to break. And of course, that means we're losing our eggs. Cannibalism, where we have severe picking happening, sometimes that can be a nutritional imbalance. So maybe we aren't doing as good a job of making sure we have good feed available. It might be boredom or crowding, and certainly if there are injury to birds, that can rouse their curiosity and cause them to investigate and lead to picking injuries even more. Feather picking, very similar. And again, if we're seeing this happening a lot, we'd consider whether we have too many birds or if we have proper feeding happening or not. So certainly we can have some negative behaviors that occur. Mentioned it earlier, predators are a constant threat to our flocks. Don't forget that domestic animals can very much be a predator of your chickens. So even your cat or your dog, if you introduce chickens to them, there could be a negative thing there happening. So especially the smaller the bird, or in particular, when we're talking about chicks, we need to be very cautious how we're letting our pets interact with them. Rats themselves, not only are they attractant to the feed, but they can actually prey on the chickens themselves, particularly chicks. Snakes can be a concern. Some are after the chicks, some are after the eggs. So it is something to be aware of. Hawks and owl, or flying predators, are a very real concern. Owls, because they're typically hunting at night, if we're doing a good job locking up our chickens, are not as big of a concern. Hawks, if we're letting our chickens free range and we have hawks in the area, hawks will be repeated visitors. If they are successful at hunting your chickens, they're liable to come back. Birds of prey, hawks are protected, so there's not really anything we can do other than keep our chickens protected in a cover run so we don't have that problem. And certainly there's any number of wildlife that will be happy to have an easy meal from chickens. And so I would just say, be aware of that and make sure you're doing a good job when you're constructing that coop to protect them. A lot of predation does happen at night. So having a well-closed house and you shutting them in whenever it gets dark is a good way to reduce the chances of predators having success. If the predator does have success, they will come back. Like any of us, you give me a free meal, I'll show up again. And so they're exactly the same way. So certainly removal of the predator, whether through trapping or hunting, might be a possibility, but it's not an option with hawks and owls. And if something is causing a problem, we've got to make some sort of change. My parents once actually had a scenario where the enclosure itself wasn't having a problem. The chickens were safe, but the raccoons were actually reaching through the wire and into the feeder and eating feed. And so they were actually every night cleaning out any leftover feed. And so they eventually had to be trapped out. But there are scenarios where, those predators are coming into your backyard. And it may not be the birds are in direct concern, but there still might be a loss happening because of wildlife. So just consider all the possibilities and ways to eliminate or reduce the exposure of your flock to them. Again, I'm not going to spend a long time on this, but basically there are sometimes some indicators, one possible predator over another, just on how they will either kill the animal or what they consume from the hen itself. So just understand this is available to you if you need it. Not going to spend long on this because, one, I'm not an expert on diseases, but basically the key to understanding diseases is basically we need three things that happen at the same time, and that's the pathogen or the disease agent, an environment that promotes that disease, and then a susceptible host. And so typically our chickens are susceptible to some diseases. We could have the disease coming in some way, and certainly the environment is permissible. I am not an expert on disease, but you can learn to know what your animals look like and how they act. And typically what we see is something abnormal. The chickens aren't as active, they're isolated from the flock. Then you start looking, you see, swelling, you see discharge, you notice labored breathing, things that aren't normal. And so when you see something that's not normal, that should give us pause to say, okay, what's going on, and look harder. I would just say that when it comes to diseases, we have, not great options always for treatment. So there are some medicated feeds that can prevent some diseases, such as coccidia. And certainly we have vaccines for coccidia as well as some other diseases. Not all vaccines are created equal. So there are vaccines that will protect the chicken itself, but that doesn't necessarily mean it couldn't allow it to spread a disease to another hen or another chicken. And so some of the Merrick vaccines fall into that category. So I know a local backyard chicken keeper who ran into that scenario where they purchased vaccinated hens to add to their flock. And unfortunately, they introduced a disease that way. In theory, they did everything that they could, everything that you would expect, but the vaccine was not such that it would prevent them from transferring it to other chickens. And so now that's something they have to deal with whenever they're looking to buy additional chickens. They basically have a chicken yard that's now contaminated. And so that's something they continue to deal with, even though they were kind of doing the best practices to begin with. So it is something to be cautious with. I really like using quarantines for animals. And so this can help if you're bringing in a new fowl of any kind, keeping them physically separated for a period of time. That way, if they happen to be, sick themselves, but maybe not showing symptoms yet, it allows you to have them separated. It works for some things, it doesn't work for others, so it's not a magical cure. But certainly if I'm bringing in new animals, if I can have them in a different coop, isolated from my current flock, it's going to be safer for me. In the longer period I can keep that separation, the better. We can't go back in time, but we can sometimes give ourselves a chance to observe those animals and make sure everything's okay. I encourage you to have your chicks vaccinated if it's an option with the hatchery you might be purchasing from. I think prevention is much better than trying to cure something once we know we have it, with that caveat that I mentioned earlier that not every vaccine will prevent the spread, even if it protects that chicken. So just be aware of that. If we do have sick birds, do we need to panic? You know, during certain times of year, we hear about avian influenza, for instance. The truth is, if you just have one bird die, it happens sometimes. And there's any number of reasons it might happen. And certainly, if you're having difficulties, we can reach out to specialists. We have the ability to send you to the animal diagnostic lab at UT. So there are some options available to us. I will say with avian influenza, the animals get sick and then the next day they're dead. So there isn't a prolonged illness. There isn't something. And so that's one of the marked things about it is it's not you have an animal that's having problems for days. They're fine one day, they get sick and then they're dead. So luckily we don't typically have frequent outbreaks of avian influenza in backyard flocks. Some of the largest concerns for avian influenza are when we have waterfowl interacting with our chickens. So we have them on a pond, and we have migrating waterfowl that are stopping on the pond. That's a high risk scenario, much more so than anything else. So oftentimes we don't see transmission to backyard flocks simply because they're not really exposed to, for instance, avian influenza. So don't let that being reported in the news necessarily concern you. Common sense, try to keep your flock away from wild birds, particularly wild waterfowl, but it's not something to be truly in fear of. And the thing I would say is just keep in mind that, your flock is relying on you. And so, certainly they have some ability with their native instincts, but we are, responsible for their health, their care, and their well-being. And so make sure that you're always being proactive. And so certainly, no one can prevent everything, but being deliberate in our actions can help the health and safety of that flock be maintained. Real quickly, I did want to mention one thing, and I'm almost done, and that's the concerns we could have for our health with animals. So every year, there are folks that get sick and hospitalized from, for instance, salmonella that came from backyard poultry. So if you know someone that has an immune compromising issue, they really, shouldn't be exposed directly, such as like handling the birds or things like that. And that's sometimes hard when we have little folks that like animals, but we need to be cautious on how we allow both the youngest and the oldest and those who may have a health compromised condition, how they interact with birds. Because truthfully, we can have animals that might have salmonella, for instance, and they appear perfectly fine to us. And it's not a threat directly to that animal's health, but it would be a threat to someone else's. So making sure we do some very basic things, hand washing after we've been interacting with these animals, paying attention to where, if we have our muck boots or other shoes that we wear out doing our poultry chores, making sure we're not taking those and walking through the house. And then we have our, grandbaby or child or niece or nephew crawling through where we walked with those shoes on. Some very basic things like that, just to help limit possible exposures that way, can really help prevent problems. And so again, this is not something that commonly happens, but it can happen. And I will say sometimes this happens because folks will sometimes think of chickens as pets, and that's awesome, but chickens belong outdoors. There have been scenarios where people have had chickens, in the bedrooms of children and things like that, or in the kitchen, and then we have an illness directly attributed to those chickens being there. So as long as we use some common sense, I think, and some basic cleaning practices, we'll probably all be okay. But it's worth mentioning, if you've not been around livestock before, we do want to consider how we make sure we keep ourselves and others safe as we're interacting with them. So with that, I think keeping chickens is definitely enjoyable and rewarding. Um, it does absolutely come with a cost, both financially and in time. We probably don't recoup that in our what we produce from the chickens, but certainly the enjoyment we can gain from it, I think more than makes up for it. Pay attention if you're in an area that does have regulations. If you're in the city limits, for instance, make sure you're planning ahead. Consider some what if scenarios. Pick a breed that's going to meet your needs. Consider biosecurity. If you are bringing in additional animals to your flock, how are you going to do that? And are you looking at doing things like vaccine? And then lastly, predators are always going to be out there looking for the opportunity. So anything we can do to protect our flock is a positive. And so with that, I will pause for questions.